Hey everyone, welcome to the Darshan Talks live stream. I'm your host, Darshan Kulkarni. It's my mission to help you trust the products you depend on. As you may know, I'm an attorney, I'm a pharmacist, and I advise companies with FDA-regulated products. So if you think about drugs, wonder about devices, obsess over pharmacy, this is the live stream for you. I do have to specify I am an attorney. My guest is an attorney, but neither of us are your attorneys. So this is not legal advice. I am a pharmacist, but I'm not your pharmacist. This is not clinical advice. I do these live streams, these podcasts, these interviews because they're a lot of fun, and I find myself learning something new every single time. So it's always great to know when someone's listening. So if you like what you hear, please leave a comment, please subscribe. If you want to ask our guest questions, please feel free to do so. Just send them in. After the talk, please share the video. I do want to emphasize these are considerations. They don't necessarily reflect the opinions of the host or the guest or their employers or even myself. If you want to find me, you can always find me on Twitter at Darshan Talks, or just go to our website at darshantalks.com. Our guest today, our live stream today is going to be really fun. We've actually had our guest on before, and it was a lot of fun the last time, and it was actually very well received as well. So if you are interested in COVID, if you are interested in ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, and why are certain drugs allowed while others aren't, if you want to talk about therapeutic options, if you want to talk about how to choose your medicine, which is coincidentally the name of his book, I welcome you to today's interview. Our guest today is a professor of law and affiliate professor of history at American University. I love the title affiliate professor because I have so many questions about what that actually means, but we'll have that discussion when it comes into it. But our guest for today, Louis Grossman. Hey, Louis, how are you?
Hey, nice to see you again.
Good to see you again. So let's start a little bit with the basics. First of all, you have a book out. Could you talk to us a little bit about why you wrote the book?
So one thing that I think it's important to make clear is that it is sheer serendipity that this book was released in the middle of a pandemic. I started writing the book 5-6 years ago.
Oh.
And it is on freedom of therapeutic choice as an idea in America and the way that it has affected American law and policy. And when I started it, I was focusing more on efforts to obtain access to drugs that people wanted and types of doctors that people wanted, as opposed to resisting compulsion. That is not because I'm not interested in resisting compulsion, but because there had been so much stuff already written about the anti-vaccination movement. But as I found the COVID epidemic or pandemic descending on us, I all of a sudden found myself dealing with a very, very topical issue. And I've wrapped more and more resistance to compulsion into my my work, as well as desire for certain therapies.
So I find that really interesting because you talk about forced action. I really want to get into forced action, but before we get into forced action, we almost need to talk about compelled speech, which is exactly what you see, for example, in cigarette ads, where they require you to have a statement on there saying that it's injurious for your health. What is, and I don't know of anyone else who'd be more perfectly placed than you to ask about this, because you understand food and drug law, you understand constitutional law. What is that balance, if you will, between compelled speech, when must it be compelled, and when is compelled action requirement to take a vaccine, and how do those balance out?
So you're asking me to compare two things that I've never actually compared before in my head: compelled speech versus compelled action. And of course, compelled action is a huge spectrum in and of itself, ranging from having a needle stuck into your body to, waiting for the red light to change before you cross the street. And so I don't know that I have some kind of grand theory of connection between compelled speech and compelled action. I will say that both are referred to within the constitutional U.S. Constitution itself. We have a First Amendment that guarantees free speech, and we have a due process clause that guarantees liberty, and liberty concerns what you can do and what you cannot do. But I'd have to think more about whether there's any kind of useful overlap between the legal analysis of those two issues.
I appreciate that. And that's the weird thing about this podcast. We ask questions that we kind of go, I haven't thought of that one before. So
I will say, by the way, that
yeah.
For your listeners, one thing that's interesting is that within the world of commercial free speech doctrine, which we can talk about as much as you want, and maybe on another day as well, that in general the government is less restricted in compelling you as a manufacturer, at least, to say certain things in your labeling than it is more restricted in telling you that you can't say certain things in your labeling. So there's a dichotomy there too.
Explain that a little bit. What do those words actually mean from a constitutional law perspective, where the government can force you to say certain things, but cannot force you? So repeat that out for me. Express it out.
Well, I mean, they can force you to say certain things.
Right.
One thing that's interesting, and we're getting far afield of COVID here, but for most of American history until the middle of the 20th century, commercial speech was deemed not to be protected by the First Amendment. And it's only in the past, 7 decades or so that commercial free speech doctrine has arisen. But it is not subject, restrictions on commercial speech are not as protected as, or commercial speech is not as protected as, for example, political speech or artistic speech or scientific speech. But there is so it's protected, but it's not as protected. And then there's the issue of whether or not the government can require, for example, a manufacturer to put something on the label to prevent the consumer from being misled in some way. And I don't want to start spouting case names, but there is a separate case that puts the government at even a lower level of scrutiny when it comes to mandating that sort of speech.
So you touched on this, and you and I had a quick conversation about this before we started, but I have to touch on this for those people who are in medical affairs, because what you talked about is the differing standards between scientific discussion, which almost is exempt from government scrutiny if it's done appropriately, or at least I guess that's not true. What I meant to say is it's based on, you have a heightened level of scrutiny for scientific discussion versus commercial speech, which the FDA very much has authority to control and allow you to speak. To me, that speaks to the distinction between what sales reps can say and versus what medical affairs can say. Could you talk a little bit more about that distinction? Why it matters? Why is there almost a completely different set of laws that apply? And what does that mean as we start getting into a place where physicians go, I don't trust pharma, and bringing in the issue of trust? How does that tie into this idea that even though both are coming from pharma companies, one of these is not like the other?
Well, let me start by saying that the courts have been pretty uniform in deciding that even something that looks on its face like scientific speech will be regulated as commercial speech if it is disseminated by a pharmaceutical company. And so we end up in the odd situation, although it's been loosened up by some decisions, where the only people in the world who are not allowed to disseminate information about, for example, off-label uses of drugs are the company itself. Now, I will say that some judges have recognized the awkwardness of this situation and do now allow pharmaceutical companies to disseminate purely scientific information and have limited the government's ability to restrict that dissemination. But it is still not treated the exact same as if you or I or Stephen Hawking or whoever were to be talking about scientific information.
Which really brings the question of during COVID, we had situations where, and now I'm getting into the ethics meets law discussion, which is really very much your bailiwick. So I expect you'll be okay, but feel free to go. I don't really know. But when we start talking about COVID and we start talking about situations like hydroxychloroquine and we start talking about ivermectin, do you think that if there was a branded company that made those products, and I don't believe there are anymore because these are really ancient drugs, do you think that they would have had a duty to disseminate or correct incorrect information to the extent it exists?
So that's a very, very tough question. When and it really doesn't matter, does it, whether it's a branded company or a generic company? The duty, if there is one, I think would apply to a generic company as well. But when a company has the duty based on widespread use of a drug off-label to say something, and all I can say is that, you know, companies are kind of between a rock and a hard place in that situation, because by talking about an off-label use, you're talking about an off-label use. You're not supposed to be doing that without FDA's, you're generally not supposed to be doing that. I would advise any company that's in any situation like that to talk to FDA and sort out a solution to that problem. But you raise another interesting thing about ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. There's been a long recent history of, first of all, I want to point out that anti-vaccinationism has always been closely linked to desire for unorthodox therapies. They're the yin and yang of each other. And so this is not new. The notion that people who oppose mandatory vaccination would also want access to alternative treatments. What's an interesting twist here is, as you said, ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine they're not, natural products. They're not alternative medicine. They are old orthodox drugs that are sold completely legally on label for certain conditions. But nonetheless, the passion that people have developed for these as treatments for COVID-19 bear similarities to the way that people fought, for example, the alternative drug Laetrile in the 1970s, or other alternative remedies. And I find this kind of an intriguing phenomenon where it's kind of 1 foot in the scientific world and 1 foot out of the scientific world. And I think what a large part of what's going on there is suspicion on the part of some that that the pharmaceutical industry is in some way suppressing information about these alternative remedies in order to goose their own profits. And that is a long-time theme in American freedom rhetoric too. The notion that there is an unholy alliance between the government and private interests, be they the AMA or pharmaceutical companies, to kind of profit off American bodies. And I think that's a large part of what's going on here. The fact that they're generic is very, very important to the rhetoric around them. But then that takes us to monoclonal antibodies, which are not generic. And I don't know whether there's as much enthusiasm amongst the anti-vaccination community for monoclonal antibodies as there is for ivermectin and as there was for hydroxychloroquine. But that is the relevant monoclonal antibodies are being disseminated according to an EUA. They are not FDA approved. They are very much on patent. They are extraordinarily expensive. And yet, from what I've heard, there are some sectors of that community who are all in on monoclonal antibodies at the same time that they are virulently against vaccines. And I just find that an interesting comparison, especially since, monoclonal antibodies are developed through the most cutting edge technologies, including genetic engineering. And so it is interesting to kind of consider, well, why enthusiasm for those and not for these? I don't know if you thought about that.
I've thought about it a little bit, but I guess in my head, it sort of connects to this idea that and then the FDA has put out a bunch of letters on this, on, for example, stem cells. And you see people coming out with potential stem cell therapies. And the FDA has come out multiple times and commented on what are the limitations associated with that and the types of claims you can make. And essentially, the FDA said that we're practicing enforcement discretion. So to your point, I think that there is a very large community of people who go, we believe in a certain therapy. You, FDA, are just dragging your heels, or you are in big pharma's pocket, and you aren't letting me have access to this. FDA, meanwhile, is going, we just don't have enough data yet. So we're not going to stop you. We're just going to see what you do. And to me, monoclonal antibodies are an offshoot, shall we say, of that. But I don't know if that's not completely accurate. And then I'll add one more component to that, because I know you're already itching for a response. I'm going to let you have that response in a second. But to me, it's similar to the world of biohacking. I've had to advise clients who are going, what stops me from injecting something into myself and putting a credit card chip into myself versus trying to give myself night vision, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The idea being, can I biohack myself? Are stem cells, biohacking, ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, and monoclonal antibodies all cut from the same cloth? Or are they completely different issues with completely different thought processes behind them? What do you think?
So, I mean, and then I would also add to that spectrum the truly alternative remedies that are being bandied about, like what's that called, like silver colloidal something. Yeah. Right? Are they all part of the same phenomenon, or are they parts of different phenomena? And I'm not really sure of the answer to it. But I will say that, if you look at the history of, for example, activism over unapproved cancer drugs, some phases in history, especially the 50s and 60s, the general mode of boosting these was to embrace the appearance of science, to say that they were developed in labs and that an esteemed scientist is the inventor and another esteemed scientist is promoting it. Whereas in the 1970s, alternative medicine or alternative cancer cures really took a turn. And you can see that in the history of Laetrile itself, which started its life as kind of a alternative pharmaceutical product and ended its life as a supposed vitamin. And there was a great deal of bipartisan support for that. What's interesting about something like monoclonal antibodies is that, on the one hand, people are embracing them as a superior alternative in their minds to mandatory vaccination. And they therefore are embracing the skill and insight and development of the American pharmaceutical industry. But they are also at the same time rejecting the notion, and I don't mean this with respect to monoclonal antibodies in specific, but just in general, they don't want to postpone trying this stuff until full, adequate and controlled studies have been completed. So they're buying one part of orthodox, clinical drug development, but not the other. And I will say, by the way, that monoclonal antibodies are are, I think, sold pursuant to an EUA. And so the FDA has taken a look at them and decided that there is enough evidence to sell them. So we're not talking here exactly about some kind of wacko product that has absolutely no basis for efficacy.
So it's interesting you talk about wacko products. I'm using that to be provocative, but I'm gonna raise the next question because that's really the title of your book, which is Choose Your Medicine. And again, can you show the book just so we're on the same page?
Pardon me?
Just show the book. There you go. That's the book. You can buy that. Where can you buy that again?
Do I look like a Price is Right product displayer?
There you go. You look like the next generation of Price is Right, Vanna Whites, if you will.
Yeah. So the good news, the bad news is there seems to be a little bit of a supply chain issues with my book. It's so hot that if you go to Amazon now, they say we'll be in stock soon. But you can buy it. It was released last week, and it's available from Amazon or directly from Oxford University Press or from your local independent bookseller. They can get it for you as well.
Congratulations again. So let's talk a little bit about that. We're talking about wacko potential therapies. What is your opinion about? I don't know how to pronounce it right. It's kratom, I guess, or kratom, Kratom, and the FDA has expressed some concerns about it. And some people say that the FDA is hiding something. Some people say you let opioids stay on the market, but you won't let kratom on there. What is your take on why should, say, a kratom be allowed, but not be allowed, but an opioid should?
Well, let me say that I haven't really looked into that issue very much, and so I don't know whether I want to spout off on something that I'm not really informed about.
Let's ignore the two products. I guess what I'm really asking about is a difference between. I guess I want to get into to educate people in general about the idea of risk-based approval and how the FDA makes those decisions. As an academic, as someone who's been an FDA regulatory lawyer, could you talk a little bit about, is there such a thing as absolutely safe? Is there such a thing as you meet this bar and now you'll definitely get approved? And some products fail to do that and other products go past it, and how that plays out.
So the answer is absolutely not. There's no platonic standard for safe and effective. Safety and effectiveness are weighed against each other in any FDA drug approval decision. And there's a lot of objective science behind determining how safe the drug is and how effective the drug is. But ultimately, the decision as to whether or not to let the product on the market and let patients and their physicians do the ultimate risk-benefit analysis, or to keep it off the market because the government has decided that no rational physician or person should ever decide to take the drug because the risks so outweigh the benefits. That line is a political line. It's a subjective line. And for all the talk about FDA as a scientific agency, that ultimate decision that they make, which is whether or not to approve a drug or not approve a drug, is soaked with judgment. And I really, really emphasize that to my students, because ultimately how much risk we're willing to take in order to potentially get so much benefit is not a scientific judgment. It's a political and personal judgment. And let me make clear that I'm not therefore saying that FDA should let everything on the market. I think it's a fuzzy line, but I think it is a line. Then there's two different issues. There's one, if you're talking about a product for which there hasn't been a full panoply of clinical trials done, whether there's enough scientific information for anybody, FDA or a doctor or patient, to make that decision. And then there's the very different question of, if all the clinical trials are completed, who should make that decision? And I will say that in recent decades, it's become a much more nuanced thing. It used to be that FDA had two choices, thumbs up or thumbs down. But now they have a lot more control over the distribution of products in a way that allows a more nuanced decision, which is, we're going to approve the drug, but we're going to restrict its distribution in this way, or we're going to educate doctors and patients in this way. And so it's become actually a much more subtle decision-making process than it used to be.
Which is really interesting. I mean, I think about everything starting from the bad ad program, where the FDA started saying, we want to teach doctors, we want to teach pharmacists, we want to teach nurses what constitutes a bad ad. So that to your point, the FDA has started making inroads into communicating with healthcare professionals, when several decades ago, there was almost this, we approve, you prescribe. And that line, as you're pointing out, is becoming more and more fuzzy.
Right.
The
And if I can interrupt for a second,
please.
Of course, one of the huge ironies, if that's the right word, in the entire FDA system is that even when FDA had this thumbs up, thumbs down power, which it still formally has, although it tends to use it with more nuance, but when they had this thumbs up, thumbs down power over drugs, once a drug was approved for one use, doctors were free to prescribe it for any use they wanted. That's called off-label prescription. And that's still completely legal. And that's still, by the way, true with respect to ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. Those drugs are available for their on-label conditions, and doctors are free to prescribe them off-label. So there's this entire world of medicine that has not been subjected to the same clinical research that on-label pharmaceuticals have been. This includes off-label prescriptions of medicines. It also includes, for example, many surgical procedures. There's lots of things that people do, surgeons do in the operating room, that have never been subjected to controlled clinical trials. Sometimes because even coming up with what the control would be in a situation like that is very difficult to imagine.
It's funny, the guest I had last week was an ex-FDA attorney, and she worked in the office of unapproved products. To actually have an office that has office of unapproved products speaks to the point you're making, which is not everything gets FDA approval. Doesn't mean that it doesn't work. Doesn't mean that it's the risks are greater than the benefits. It just means it hasn't been approved.
And alternative medicine advocates had been pointing out for years, this is kind of like the Achilles heel for FDA, which is FDA says to an alternative medicine manufacturer, no, we treat everything the same. We don't care if you're alternative or orthodox, whatever. We want clinical data. Right. And the comeback is often, well, how come you allow all this off-label prescribing without clinical data? Now the Office of Unapproved Drugs is, I think it's a more technical, like there's a body of drugs that, because of strange developments in the history of the implementation of the Food and Drug Act, remain on the market. But I don't want listeners to think that there's like this office out there that is like overseeing this vast universe of, specially treated products that, don't have to play by the rules or something.
I appreciate that. And thank you for that clarification. I have several more questions, but I know we usually aim for 15 to 20 minutes, and we are already at 29 minutes. So we do need to start closing up, but we have a couple of questions for you, as you know. The first question, what would you like to ask the audience?
I'd like to ask the audience, at what point for the audience does COVID-19 become the flu? And what I mean by that is something that is with us, something that is literally life-threatening for certain people, but something that you don't let disrupt your life to the point where you don't go to the movies anymore. I mean, to me, that's a big marker. It's like, when are we going to start going back to the movie theater? For years and years and years, I went to the movie theater in February during the height of flu season, and I didn't let it stop me. At what point do we accommodate this risk? We were talking about risks before. At what point do we start accommodating this risk in our society in a similar way? That's my question for the audience.
That's a great question. So I'll answer it first. The audience members are welcome to answer it as well. But my answer would be, I think we're already there. I think movie theaters are open. I actually go to the movies, and people actually, these movie theaters are full. I've got Janan commenting, it's starting to be treated like the flu already. People are so over it. I live in the South, movie theaters are back, concerts, etc. So it's already happening.
Although I'd like to see the opening weekend numbers for the new James Bond movie. And I mean, it did open this weekend, I think, or it's opening please.
But here's my question. Is it a commentary on the James Bond movie, or is it a commentary on the opening numbers and the time it's being released? But the Shang-Chi movie, for example, did really, really well. But to your point, could it have done better? And that's always the tough question, right? Could it have done better?
And you know, even just from an economic perspective, especially when you're talking about the restaurant business, they operate on such a narrow margin of profit that even just, you know, a few percentage points, let alone a 10 or 15 or 20 percentage point drop in business, can be fatal. We can have a whole other discussion about the movies and what the future of movies is.
I'm down.
But I will tell you that I have lots and lots and lots of friends and relatives who have not been to the movies since March 2020 and have no plans to go anytime soon.
Oh, that's really interesting. I seem to be having the opposite experience. Everyone I know is gone. And and I'm in Philly, so that's interesting. I know a couple people who are cautious, but I know people who have gone. So I also think so I also sometimes go to the Delaware, to lower Delaware, and they are vehemently opposed to the idea of wearing masks.
Yeah,
they consider that to be a curtailment. And again, we're speaking generalities, obviously, but they see that as a curtailment of their rights. So,
right.
Go ahead.
I mean, although it shouldn't be, nobody should deem it as a curtailment of their own rights if somebody else chooses to wear a mask. I hope people can look past that level of tribalism. But I will say, by the way, that there are other societies on Earth where mask wearing is very, very customary. And when I start to think about what ways our society is going to be different after the COVID or after the COVID crisis than before, in addition to wondering about movies, in addition to wondering about the rhythm of the work week and working from home, I also wonder about masks. And I wonder, you know, I went to Shanghai a number of years ago, and it was the norm for people to be wearing masks. I mean, actually, especially in Beijing, but also in Shanghai. Are we headed in that direction? I don't know.
This is just a personal opinion. I don't see it yet. I see why you say that, but I'm just not sure I'm seeing it yet. Janan's responding, it's definitely relative to the risk and who we're risking. My kids are back in school with masks, so my thought is, why not go to a pumpkin patch? A year ago, I wouldn't have, though. So if you're already taking certain risks, maybe you'll take more, is really what it's coming down to, is what I'm thinking Janan's saying.
Yeah, and Americans are terrible at risk assessment, absolutely awful. Any one of you out there who's riding a motorcycle, I'm not telling you not to ride a motorcycle, but if you compare the risk of riding a motorcycle statistically to the risk of taking certain medicines that you're reluctant to take, it is not even close. It's more dangerous to ride a motorcycle.
There you go. So next question, and this, we've asked this before. How can people contact you? And as part of that same question, how can they find your book?
So they can contact me at my email address, lewisg, that is LEWISG, at wcl.american.edu. I love getting inquiries and comments from people I haven't met before. And my book is just readily available the way that you would buy any book. It is just a bookstore book now. Online bookstore, regular bookstore, and I hope many of you will take a look at it and enjoy the stories that it tells.
Very, very cool. Then this is the question you've been dreading, is what you tell me. What is something you learned in the last month?
So, did you know, and I haven't verified this on a map, that the western tip of Tennessee, closer to Canada than it is to the eastern tip of Tennessee?
No, I did not.
Isn't that an amazing fact?
That is an amazing. I love this question because I get the coolest facts. I just had someone else tell me that, did you know that an octopus had 3 hearts? Like, did not know that. So this might be in that same list of, I
mean, well, an octopus has 8 legs. Why not 3 hearts?
I guess.
But how in the world could this state that we think of as a quasi-southern border state?
Yeah.
I mean, I guess what it shows as much as anything else is how darn long Tennessee is.
Again, not a state I thought that was particularly long. So you learned something really interesting.
How's that for profundity?
If I knew what the word profundity meant, I would tell you.
How's that for lack of profoundness?
Oh, now that makes sense. Okay, now I'm with you. And last question, what's something that made you happy in the last week?
So I'll turn to family again, as I did last time.
Of course.
All 3 kids are out of the house these few days, and I miss them desperately and everything. But last night, my wife and I got to sit down and watch a movie together, not at the movie theater, at home, and just sit there in a quiet house with the dog. And I felt like the rest of my life was staring me in the face, and it didn't seem at all unpleasant.
Oh my God, that is not the answer. I did not expect you to end with that sentence.
And by the way, that weird triple negative, that's an awful way to put it. It was delightful.
Very, very cool. Actually, Janan just responded to your Tennessee question, which is, I'm from Tennessee. I think it's a 60 or so mile difference. Who knew? Apparently the people in Tennessee know, which I would not have guessed that either.
Yeah. And is she 60 miles or so, confirming my fact, or my fact is not quite true? What do you think?
I think she's saying that she's confirming your fact.
Yeah.
I'm guessing. So she'll let us know if she's not.
And it also, by the way, goes to the weirdness of the U.S.-Canada border.
Yeah,
so you also have to take that into account.
I have to ask a weird question because I'm curious. As someone who's a food and drug lawyer, I love talking to you because it's just I get to learn something really cool. And I'm talking to someone who, oh, by the way, she does confirm you are right. I love talking to you because I find myself talking to someone who kind of gets what I get and it's fun. But I'm curious, do your kids think you are extremely cool, or are you like every other dad?
Let me start by saying there's no way they think I'm like every other dad.
Okay, that's good.
I definitely have some characteristics that are definitely mine.
Okay.
They definitely think I'm a nerd, but I think they think I'm a cool nerd.
Okay.
And it's partly because food and drug law touches on all of our daily lives and even on sort of popular culture in a way that is just intrinsically interesting to everybody. And so I'll give you just a short example. One of my first projects as a food and drug lawyer was a milk labeling project. And I won't get into the details, but basically I was involved in a post-Nutrition Labeling and Education Act effort to revise milk labeling so that it would be in line with labeling of everything else. And so I submitted a petition as an attorney, and FDA embraced the petition. And today, for example, 2% milk is reduced fat milk, yep, rather than low fat milk because of that petition. My kids have been heard to tell their friends that my father invented milk labeling. So is that cool or not cool? I don't know, but it's a pretty, it's a pretty, great thing to be able to say that your dad did. And yeah, I think that they are getting a real kick out of the release of the book because, I had written textbooks before, yeah, but to actually see a book, with like a pretty cover and, the blurbs on the back and sold on Amazon and everything, I think that they think that's pretty darn cool.
Well, it's funny because Janan's actually a publisher as well. So she is fascinated by these topics as well. So I don't want to put words in her mouth, but you're definitely cool in my book. But it's good to know that if and when I have kids, I have a chance that I might be cool. So you've convinced me that I need to add one more question to my list going forward, which is, what is one cool fact about you? And I think that would be, you invented milk labeling. I'll take that
one. And by the way, sheer chance that Janan is from Tennessee. Who'd have known that the random fact I would come up with would be a Tennessee fact? I would have been scared to float it if I'd known there would be an actual person from Tennessee on the call.
Well, there are all kinds of people listening in, and we're always surprised and welcome all of them coming on. And I think that was actually the fourth question. So do you have anything else you want to add, or should we hope to get you on next time?
I just look forward to speaking to you again at some point in the future.
Perfect. Louis, thank you again. This was so much fun, as always. I'm excited to have you on again.
Thank you.
And hopefully by then, your book will be sold on Amazon and they'll actually have it.
Yeah, I mean, it's selling like hotcakes, everybody. You'll be lucky to get your hand on a copy, but try.
I agree. But thanks again, Louis.
So thank you very much.